Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today's episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of status of the healthcare system and a couple threats, several threats that are making it tougher and tougher to be, one, both a consumer and also tough to be a provider. So if you're a provider listening, hopefully this will speak to you. If you're a consumer listening, either one, you're already aware of this, or two, hopefully it'll be a little bit eye-opening to what the stress is on the system, and then what are the consequences of this. I've shot this episode a few times, so let's see if I can organize this better. So let's start first with how insurance works and some pitfalls in that. Number two, talk a little bit about healthcare system in general, independent of insurance, and the slippery slope that's happening there. And then I don't know if I'm going to go into number three. Number three is basically there's just a lot of responsibility on consumers now to manage their own experiences, which is not always how it used to be. And while personal responsibility is a good thing, it can be a dangerous thing too, and not really a smart thing. And then what are we seeing providers do and the implications for that? That's the general gist for today. So let me see if I can keep this part brief, the insurance part. How does insurance work? Now I'm going to miss a lot, but I just want to give a gist of when it goes wrong. I'll say a little bit of how it goes right though first, because I don't want this to sound too skewed. So insurance companies in general are a way for people to access care that might be outside their fiscal ability to afford. And that's an important thing for any society to have, because especially cutting edge, kind of newer treatments, much like technology, they tend to be more expensive. And they're just not going to be accessible to everybody. And so insurance, everybody pays into it, and then they pay out claims to make sure that people have access to the care that they need. And that's a good thing. That is absolutely a good thing. What's also important is understand these providers are submitting these claims and saying, I need this, I did this, pay me for it. And, an honor system would work great if an honor system makes sense, but an honor system is dangerous. Even well-intentioned providers can fall into traps of providing more than what is necessary for care. One of the safeguards outside of insurance is our licensing boards. We can get in trouble for the really egregious bad stuff, but it doesn't really constitute the kind of more finer tune, like what's the best thing to do. Now, let me be clear, there's a lot of providers that are up on the research and they really are being intentional. And so this level of oversight is really not as necessary. I will say, every once in a while I'll learn something from an insurance company that makes me reconsider how I practice things, because science often is independent of the fiscal cost of doing things super responsibly. And so there is this push on providers to be more economical with their time, which to a degree can make sense. They also have the power and the latitude to compile a lot of research that we simply cannot do as providers. I cannot constantly be combing research because guess what? I have to see people and help people in the various types of work that I do in this profession. I simply do not have that time. And so if what I'm doing is clinical and I'm submitting information and, whatever it might be to the insurance company, it's good for me sometimes for them to be like, well, technically in this case, or the research would say that in this particular case, you might be able to do this through this service, or you wouldn't need this additional time, or whatever it might be. And medical providers all the same. I think hopefully every once in a while it's a call to action, be like, maybe I need to reconsider how I use this particular type of test for my, my medical practice. And that can be a good thing. Now, the not so good things. As you're probably already guessing, there's bias here, because while an insurance company is technically beholden to the consumer and thereby ensuring that they have access to quality clinical care, they are also a for-profit company. And as claims and submissions for all sorts of services increase over time, this includes a decrease of stigma around mental health services, so there's an increased provision of mental health services over time. They do have some fiscal straits that they have to navigate. I'm not saying their fiscal setup is wise, but they have to navigate that. And so at the end of the day, basic ones and twos bean counting, they have to be careful fiscally, which means that there is a pool to focus more on the fiscal issue than your clinical care. And that is already a delicate balance. Never mind greed, and never mind people just trying to keep their finances independent of caring about your clinical care. And those people do exist. I don't want to say it's everywhere and be, kind of it's cool to shit on insurance companies these days and just be like, they're all evil. It's like, no, that's not the case. But I guarantee you there's some straight up corporate greed that's just floating around there a la carte too. Especially when you consider how many insurance companies there are and how many people are employed at these companies. Basic 101 on human beings. You're not going to have this utopian existence in one insurance company where everybody is a bleeding heart and manages clinical first above all else, and they will barely skirt by fiscally. And they are just, martyrs. Not martyrs. They are, not the martyr, they truly are servants. They're at all costs. That's not how that works. Too many people, too many cooks in that kitchen. So there's already that rub, that finances are having to be, they are of equal importance to your clinical care, and that's already a dangerous precedent. On top of that, how does one wield research responsibly, assuming research has all the answers? And the answer is it's not always wielded responsibly. These insurance companies, they do offload this typically onto for-profit companies that consolidate a lot of research in a particular field or across fields. So the insurance company has this kind of manual, if you will, that it can look at and say, like, well, the research says, like, this would not be indicated till the third time, or these other sort of like cheaper, more accessible treatments need to be done first before we're going to authorize or pay for this higher level of care. And once again, a dialectic is created where in some ways that's actually a really good thing. It makes sure that we're not going to, the worst case scenario and doing services that might not be fixed better with something kind of cheaper first. Now, I will readily note that there's almost always going to be cases where the higher level of care was more necessary first, and delays actually cost the person quite a bit. But this is a stats game, and from a finance point of view, they're like, we're not going to pay millions of dollars more every year just in the off chance that you, the N of one, the sample size of one, gets the care you needed first, and the other 99 people never needed it. It sucks to be that one person, no doubt. But there is some degree of sensibility to some of these decisions. What is challenging, though, there's lots of research out there that never gets published, and or the research is used in a skewed way, whether it's the for-profit company creating the standards or it's the insurance company's interpretation of the standards that they pay for, noting that they don't even have to follow the standards technically that they pay for. On top of all of this, research, I've kind of already alluded to this, research does not always apply to your particular case. And the fact that they might not listen to your provider who has done the research, they're not just willy-nilly throwing everybody at a particular procedure. They literally would not typically do this, but for your particular case, say this is merited and this is why it's merited, and the insurance company can still say, screw you, too bad, so sad, it's not a standard. And that, I think, is the particularly bad rub for providers when they're like, look, I'm not irresponsible with this, and you're going to fight me on this particular case because of some stat that doesn't even apply to this particular patient, this particular case. You've got to be kidding me. And that is where I think, a lot of consumers aren't necessarily aware that this kind of balance, the struggle is going on behind the scenes all the time. Now, let me make sure I'm not being hyperbolic. It's not like they are scrutinizing every single claim. They do not. There are certain services that are more, there's more oversight and more kind of scrutinizing of them. And so I don't want it to sound like, every day of my life I'm fighting with an insurance company. But it is more frequent than you would probably think it would be. And it is more stressful and taxing on a system and or individual provider than you might think it would be. And the amount of times it is necessary versus unnecessary kind of depends. I mean, there's definitely providers out there that are very irresponsible in their care, but there are a lot of very solid providers that are pulling their hair out because they're like, I am not the irresponsible one. Like, I am doing what feels necessary, and you are just constantly creating headaches for me. So this is creating an increased adversarial relationship between your providers, or if you're a provider, you and these insurance companies. Now let's add some insult to injury here and talk about the healthcare system in general. On top of all of these frustrations, the easiest way to navigate these frustrations with insurance companies is working for a larger company that basically has a large billing department that takes care of these things. They get to understand the trends, the how the different insurers work and operate, and they can be really savvy people that help out with this quite a bit. But that's assuming working at a company is a healthy thing for your mental health and your well-being as a provider. And increasingly, the answer is working for a company is just as bad. I might as well hire a biller myself and do it myself than working for this company, because the company culture is unhealthy, or they have their own rub between provider well-being and their own fiscal outcomes, their own finances, which we as providers are not always privy to, nor do we get a say in what these companies are spending money on. And so this rub very frequently leans more towards profit than it is the health of the provider, or even the provision of care that they deem necessary. As with the insurance companies, these companies can in some ways act as like a steering of a ship. They're making sure that the providers aren't just taking an inordinate amount of time on a service that should really not take that much time. But it again smells of this guilty until proven innocent methodology that puts a lot of good providers that sure could use a little bit of feedback here and there and make sure they're on the straight and narrow. I consider myself one of those people. Every once in a while, I appreciate a call out there like, do you really need to be taking quite that much time on that? All right, cool. That's a good call to action. Fair enough. But very frequently, I get caught up because someone else was not billing appropriately, or I get caught up in some sort of drama in the system, or a medical provider gets caught up because somebody else is inefficient with their time, and so one kid ruins recess for the rest of the class is often the vibe. And this disincentivizes providers to really stick with a company for very long. Never mind the effects of burnout, are going to be to some degree impairing the provider's engagement in their job throughout that time. Now, a lot of providers can contain phenomenally well and still provide very good services. But there's many providers who get so burnt out, their quality of the care that they're providing does go down, secondary to these stressors and secondary to all these problems. And that has an impact on you if you are a consumer. Now, on top of all of this stuff, well, there are definitely well-meaning leaders in many of these systems. Many larger systems are getting bought up by private equity firms. Now, these private equity firms could indeed include an amalgam of people who really care about the medical field, or really care about the mental health field. But in many ways, that rub continues again, that the finances might matter more than their care. And so you have not their care, your care. Their finances matter more than your care. And so these many links up on the chain, these investors that you don't ever get to see or hear of, and aren't even required to be shown on websites and stuff. Like, you don't even know as a consumer, and sometimes providers don't even know that their executives and their boards report to private equity firms to make sure that they're fiscally making money, that the investment of the money into this field is yielding the investors a return. And so that gets really gross really fast. Never mind the private equity firms that do not give a shit about what they are investing in. They are investing because that particular sector makes a lot of money. Full stop. And what does that do to a company culture? And what does that do to the balance of provider care and client care versus finances? I hate to be a cynic, but I can guess where that often lands. And so all of this you hear is putting stress on the provider network. We can talk even about education and how education is going, and how education mills often push providers out unprepared. debt related to getting into the profession. This is supply and demand issue. I mean, this is a system in crisis, essentially. And so the providers, whether it's on the fiscal side through insurance companies and the stressors associated with that, or the stressors associated working with a company versus a small practice or independent practice, often pushes them either one, completely out of the field. Like there's straight up people who spend all this time, all this money getting the education, they get so burnt out, they leave the freaking field. If you can imagine that. So much commitment of time and energy, and somebody just leaves the field completely. That is wild to me. That's how bad it can get. Never mind suicide. Suicide rates on providers, particularly medical providers. I mean, this is serious, serious stuff where they are unwell, like they are not doing well mentally because of the stressors of the field. That's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is they either hop between companies, which providers, consumers frequently complain about. Like, I don't know what provider I'm going to see, because just give it 2 years and they're going to switch out. Or they leave organizations completely and go to private practice. Now, if you're a consumer, might say, well, that sounds pretty good. Why can't I find them in the private practice? Well, guess what they're often doing in their private practice? They restrict what insurances they take because they don't want to deal with the ones that don't pay as well or give them more of a hassle. Or sometimes the insurance companies don't let them impanel anyway because they're like, oh, no, we have enough providers. We're not going to let you do that. You got to go see this giant conglomerate company instead of seeing this private practitioner. And the final option is that they only accept cash, not cash, but, they private pay only, that they don't accept insurance at all. Now, you as a consumer can technically take what they bill you, and they call a super billing, and submit it to your insurance company and see if your insurance company might reimburse, and they often will, to the credit of the insurance company. Now, sometimes they will only reimburse a portion of it, though, and that at least saves you a little bit of money. But outside of that, you're paying out of pocket. And so if you're doing some of the math, what is the issue here? Well, beyond the fact that your providers are hella stressed and they don't have enough time to do half the services that they want to do due to fiscal pressures and administrative pressures, well, there's also an equity issue as far as your ability to get the care that you need and you desire. On the one hand, we have these large systems with a lot of resources, and that can be a good thing if they are wielded responsibly. But those systems are often strapped and stressed and lean more towards fiscal demands and arguments rather than the clinical arguments. And people with insurance and or people who cannot afford for out-of-pocket, there is a potential that you're getting a lower overall quality of care than someone who has the ability to pay out of pocket. Now, we can point the finger at the providers and say, how dare you? Why would you do such a thing? If you're such a good provider, why not make yourself accessible to more people? Well, listen to everything I just said. I'm increasingly in this camp. I've worked for community mental health for over a decade of my life, and at some point, I got to tap out. And that tapping out process, I'm not like jazzed about accepting insurance because of all of these issues. And so instead, we should point to the systems themselves. We should point to the industry and the owners of these businesses and say, like, you need to do a better job. How you set prices, how you treat your providers, how you are owned and operated, and transparency around that needs to be scrutinized. Never mind, increasingly, there has already been a push against insurance companies saying, like, who are you to cause so much headache for providers? Like, sure, there are responsible things that you are doing, but can you do it with a little bit more mindfulness about provider well-being? Never mind the cascading effect it has on your consumers, the people who are paying you money for insurance coverage. You should be more responsible, more diligent, and frankly transparent with how you operate and when and why you deny claims, because right now it is a convoluted mess that if we as providers can barely understand it, how are you, if you are a consumer, supposed to understand it for yourself? Answer is you barely can. You barely can. and your ability to have any power in the system is quite limited. This is why we've periodically seen a bunch of class action, large lawsuits against insurance companies when they do these shenanigans, because the power of the many is the only voice that many of these folks have. The power of the one, you get nowhere in these companies. So all this to say, their providers need to step up their game. There's lots of providers out there that I think could do a better job, whether it's, get better training or just apply themselves more. But I've grown very wary of hearing that as the first and foremost argument, instead of an argument against the greater systems within which us providers have to live and exist. This goes to the final point, is that increasingly, amidst all of this chaos, consumers are incredibly responsible. They're left to be incredibly responsible for managing their own care, which is insane when you think about the amount of money, the amount of administrative burden and oversight, and all this junk that all these companies, whether it's the provider's company or the insurance company, and somehow, you as a consumer still have to keep diligent track of all of your records and make sure you know who you're seeing and why you're seeing them, and make sure you come in with all the questions you possibly have in case your provider is too rushed, or have all the information you might need to help empower them or empower yourself to, contest denied claims or whatever it might be. And it is exhausting. And if you've not done this before, well, congratulations. You're probably relatively healthy, or you're doing kind of more general care. And so, again, to credit insurance companies, they often don't scrutinize the general care quite as much. So you get into a little bit less of these fights. But the minute you need any specialized care, or there's extra things that aren't going well for you, you can find yourself very quickly wrapped into the system of dysfunction. And it's the last thing you need, on top of your own distress and on top of you trying to take care of yourself, is having to be your own secretary, trying to keep track of all this crap to make sure that you don't get screwed over as a consumer. There's something particularly audacious about that experience, on top of everything else that's going on. I mean, the math adds up. When the systems are stressed, there's a pull towards fiscal demands. Your providers are overstressed and overstretched. Of course, things are going to trickle down to the consumer, but it shouldn't be that way. But again, that's a perfect reflection of the system at hand. It's a perfect reflection of the current dysfunction of this overall system of healthcare, and how healthcare is financed and delivered in this country. I don't pretend to have all the answers, right? Some people say, well, universal healthcare is the fix. Well, it's a fix in a lot of ways, but you talk about administrative oversight and how administrative procedures work, that has its own massive kinks and massive challenges that you would have to work through. Never mind oversight and all those sorts of things. So I don't pretend to have the answers, but I think we really need to be constantly talking about this crisis that's in front of us, because I don't personally see any signs that it's going to get better quickly, rapidly. And so the power of I think consumers and providers speaking up more and more about this is probably the best way to elevate in importance before it gets too bad, before it becomes very hard to steer this ship back to a place where there is a lot of care that is accessible and the quality of that care is quite high, or at least higher. We've already got a big hill to climb, and if we don't act soon, that hill is just going to get bigger and bigger, and soon it'll be a mountain. And that is not a fun place to be in. It sure as hell isn't for me as a provider. Sure as hell is not me thinking of myself as a consumer, particularly as I get older. And it sure as hell does not sound terribly nice for all the people that I see that frequently complain to me about these processes. And I get it. So, I don't know if this particular shoot went better. I've, again, tried this a few times and it just feels very jumbled, but hopefully that made some sense of the issues with insurance, the issues with the healthcare system and the businesses that run therein, the cascading effect it has on the availability of providers and who's out there, and the consequences it is having on consumers, all wrapped into one episode. So yeah, hopefully that made some sort of sense. As always, I thank you for listening and or watching. I'm sorry this is a little bit of a sad episode without any real resolution, but again, thank you so much. And amidst it all, try to stay curious. Thanks so much.